I wanted to do tonight is just walk you through some of the history that's really been forgotten and help reconnect you with some of the biblical foundation. I'm going to be using the screens behind me, and I want to start with a letter. John Adams wrote Thomas Jefferson in 1813. And at this point, the letter even identifies that, hey, we're kind of old men now, but like 40 years ago when this all was getting started, John Adams says, remember when we first got together and as a group, we argued all the time. We disagreed about so much. But then in the letter, he identifies where they found common ground. And here's what he wrote in the letter. He said, the general principles on which the fathers achieved independence were the general principles of Christianity. Where they found common ground were the principles of Christianity. They disagreed about a lot, and they did argue a lot. But the common ground was Christianity. And why that's interesting is historically, this was so well documented that this was never even disputed historically until like a couple decades ago. Because everybody that actually studied original writings recognized the influence of the Bible, the influence of pastors and Christians. As an example, there was a professor at Duke University. Her name was Alice Baldwin. She's the one that started the women's program at Duke University. She was a professor there in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. She wrote a book in 1928 called The New England Clergy and the American Revolution. This is the book she wrote. What's interesting about this book is she tracks the pastors that were the most influential in the founding era. But one of the things she points out in this book, which by the way is very well documented, she points out that by the time you get to the Declaration of Independence, the founding fathers, as they're presenting all these ideas, she says every single idea in the Declaration had been preached from American pulpits prior to 1763, which is more than a dozen years before we even get to the Declaration of Independence. And the point she makes is there was not a single unique idea the founding fathers had. Instead, they were repeating what they had heard from their pastors in the decades leading up to this moment. Well, this would be a pretty brave and maybe brazen, like kind of ridiculous claim to say, well, the founding fathers were really influenced by pastors. Well, it would seem crazy today if you've gone through a modern education system because we didn't learn any of this. But it's not far-fetched if you know any of the story or history, because the first time the founding fathers ever got together was September 6, 1774. The very first meeting, and at this point, they're coming together, and they don't know each other yet, because every state has chosen leaders to represent them. They're going to meet for the first time, so they're in Philadelphia, Independence Hall, and they don't even know each other. So you have guys like Sam Adams meeting Patrick Henry for the first time. They don't know each other yet, but as they meet, Thomas Cushing, one of the delegates from Virginia, he makes the very first motion of the meeting. And the very first motion of the very first meeting was they should open with prayer. And like the founding fathers did, they debated it for a second, because who's going to pray? Because I don't know if, these Anglicans, we don't need them in this congregation. So they debated for a minute, but they agreed, no, we need to have prayer. And actually, one of the more famous paintings of the founding fathers is of this first prayer in Congress. This is that opening session of Congress when they got the local pastor, the Reverend Jacob Duché. He came and led them in prayer, and the records of Congress identify, and by the way, the guys who were there, they wrote about this a lot as well. The records of Congress identify that the opening prayer lasted for nearly 2 hours. It would be hard to get most Christians to have a 2-hour prayer meeting. Much less politicians, elected officials, right? And this is, again, this is worth noting. This isn't like the spiritual leaders of America. These are the ones chosen to solve the political problems, but they were so connected in faith that it was like, well, this is the obvious thing to do. If we're going to do something, we need to make sure we go to God and ask for God's help. In fact, John Adams was there, and he talked about this, writing to Abigail. And there's a lot of guys that you can go back and read their writings, because George Washington talked about this. Many guys who were there wrote about this opening moment. But one of the things that's interesting is John Adams tells Abigail that not only do we have prayer, during this time of prayer, it was decided that we should study the Bible too. And so they suggested we should get the common prayer book. It was the Anglican prayer book, and that was written back in the 1600s. But in the prayer book, it actually had assigned chapters for every day. It's like a Bible reading plan. So on this day, you're supposed to read these chapters. And he said, Abigail, when we read those chapters, it was as if God himself had ordained those chapters to be read that day. He said, you got to see what we saw. And this is part of the letter he writes to her. He says, I must beg you to read that psalm, read the 35th psalm to your friends, read it to your father. Well, Psalm 35 is one of the Psalms that David writes while he's fleeing from King Saul who's trying to kill him. And David cries out and says, God, I haven't done anything, and he seeks my destruction, Lord. You rise up, be my shield, my buckler, my strong right arm. On he goes for more than 30 verses, but this is one they read, and John Adams says it was accidentally extremely applicable to our situation, right? Meaning they weren't trying to find the most relevant verse. And by the way, a little context is also probably helpful. They had found out that the night before, the British had taken their navy and surrounded Boston Harbor, and they'd begun bombing Boston Harbor. So literally, we have a town under attack, which also then makes sense why they're like, we probably should pray. Let's start there. We need some help. But as they're in this midst of seeking God, and then they read Psalm 35, and they're like, that's for us. God is speaking to us in this moment right now. This is something that was a very significant revelation for them. Well, one of the things that actually John writes Abigail is one of the following preceding things they did. This was in a subsequent letter. He says, as Congress, we've appointed a continental fast. Now, this is the founding fathers. As they're making their plans, one of the plans they roll out with is they call for a national day of prayer and fasting. So all the colonies, we're going to have a time to go to seek God, to ask for God to help us intervene, which makes a lot of sense, because if you're going up against the greatest military power in the world at that time, you're going to need a lot of God's help. And they knew that. And so they call for a colony-wide day of prayer and fasting. And this is part of what John Adams writes to Abigail in this letter. He says, millions be upon their knees at once before their great creator, imploring his forgiveness and blessings, his smile and American counsel and arms. Now, I want to draw your attention to the fact that John Adams says millions be upon their knees. There's only about 3 million colonists at that time. So if John's like, millions will be praying, I think he's naively optimistic in assuming that everybody's going to pray. I don't know if everybody prayed, but it does even give an indication of what culture was like at that time. That if there's a call to pray, we know how to pray. And we're going to show up and pray. And this was not a unique thing historically. Again, for people that study history, this is evident. It's just that most of the time, like in modern era, when people study history, they read some modern author's story about history instead of going back to the original documents. But when you go back and read the original documents, it's fascinating what you find. As an example, this idea of prayer and fasting is not a new idea or unique in American history. By 1815, there were more than 1,400 official government prayer proclamations. Every single founding father that signed the Declaration, if and when they became a governor, they issued prayer proclamations. Now, a few things to think about this. One of the accusations that I hear often, even repeated by a lot of Christians, and I'm not going to call anybody out. I don't know what you've thought or said. Let me encourage you, maybe don't say this again, is when people are like, well, all the founding fathers were atheists, agnostics, and deists. Okay, let me just pause for a second, right? Like, number one example, right? Your Honor, Exhibit A. Okay? If they're atheists, agnostics, and deists, an atheist says there is no God, a deist or an agnostic says, we're not sure if there's a God, and a deist says there is a God, but he doesn't get involved in the world today. Okay? If you're an atheist, agnostic, and deist, you know what you're never going to do? That. Not even one of them, right? Much less 1,400 of them. And today, there's this wide belief, again, even from believers who are like, oh no, founding fathers weren't Christians, they were deists, and all these other accusations. We are overstating that to unbelievable degrees. At the time the founding fathers signed the Declaration, 55 of the 56 signers attended Orthodox denominations. The only one who didn't was Benjamin Franklin. And Benjamin Franklin, by the way, also not a deist. Okay? Benjamin Franklin, I would argue, was a Christian. But you can go, and this is readily available. You can get online, go to founders.archive.gov, and you can look up on Franklin's writings. It's one of the last letters that he wrote toward the end of his life. He wrote to Ezra Stiles. Ezra Stiles was a president of Yale University. Back then, every president of every university was a pastor, because every university was for the purpose of teaching people the gospel. And Ezra Stiles, a pastor, writes to Franklin. They gave Franklin an honorary degree because Franklin was a elementary school dropout, never had a formal education, right? But they give him an honorary degree. And so they write him and they say, we would be honored if you would send us a portrait. We want to put it up in our hall. We want to honor you. And in your long life, we're sure you've acquired a lot of portraits. Would you be willing to send one to us? And then Ezra Stiles has this little PS, postscript. He says, I'm going to ask you a question, and I mean no offense by it, but I'm just curious. where do you stand on the position of Jesus? Because I would were everybody as I am when it comes to not my flaws, but my relationship with Jesus when they know him as truly divine, the Son of God. And he goes through all this accolades of who Jesus is. He says, I'm just curious, where do you stand? But if this offends you, please ignore it. Don't even bother writing back about this. I wouldn't want to offend you in this stage of our friendship of life, whatever else. Franklin, and that was 3 months before Franklin died. A month and a half before Franklin dies, he writes his response. And he tells Ezra Stiles that I do have a lot of paintings, but I don't want to send any of them to you. Because in all my paintings, I look old and fat, and I don't want to be remembered as an old fat man. Which is just so great. There's a lot of Franklin in that. But at some point, you're like, man, if the shoe fits, I don't know what to tell you, right? Like, it's kind of who you are. But he says, in regard to your question about Jesus, he says, no one's ever asked me that question, which is also a fascinating part of his letter. Because Franklin was very good friends with George Whitefield, one of the more famous pastors and evangelists in American history, the guy arguably considered the most responsible for the First Great Awakening. Franklin built an addition on his house and asked Whitefield to live with him. He said, in Philadelphia, I have very few people that I can have this level of intellectual conversation with. Would you be willing to stay with me? I would love to get to know you more. Literally built an addition for Whitefield to live with him anytime he's in the area. He is a huge, and there's also a lot of fun stories about Whitefield too. Franklin, with his science mind, said Whitefield's voice was so powerful that one day Whitefield had this huge crowd, and Franklin wanted to know, like, how big of it, because it was a big crowd, thousands of people, how big could this crowd actually be? So Franklin got to the front where Whitefield was speaking from and began pacing away, and Franklin said it was nearly a mile before he stopped being able to understand George Whitefield's words. And so then Franklin does the math, and he's like, well, that would be this many tens of thousands of people, which is crazy. But Franklin then, in the midst of writing about Whitefield, he also said, and this is before he identifies him, he said, I went to a meeting tonight, this is in his journal, I went to a meeting tonight, and I heard this incredible speaker, but I'm very upset with myself because at the end, they asked if we wanted to give anything, like in this kind of offering scenario. He says, and I pulled out my coin purse and I gave every coin in my purse. What was I thinking? You never give everything you have. That's crazy. And so Franklin, then in his journal, he writes that he's going to go the next night, but he's going to leave his coin purse at home. So he can't be tempted. Literally, journal entry or two later, he's writing, chastising himself. What was I thinking? And he identifies, he says, I didn't even bring a coin purse, but I was so compelled at the end of his talk. I asked my neighbor to borrow money so I'd have something to put in the bucket as I went by. Okay? But like, Franklin and Whitefield are very good friends. Franklin writes Ezra Stiles a month and a half left of his life, and he says, no one's ever asked me about Jesus. Okay, how? It's like you're friends with Billy Graham and he's never talked to you about Jesus. Like, how? How was this possible? And this is something also interesting because in early America, there was such a heavy bent, regardless of the denomination, there was a very heavy bent of Calvinism. And so in the First Great Awakening, there wasn't as much of a call to come to Jesus. It was a call of recognizing the sovereignty of God and the power of God and who God was. And that God was going to choose and accept. So like even, again, regardless of the denomination, every denomination had a very heavy Calvinism bent. It's part of what actually happened in the Second Great Awakening. It was like this Arminian swing, and that's part of also why there was a lot of fracturing of churches. A lot of denominations split in that day because of the shift between the Calvinists and the Arminians. Not to digress too much, but the point is, Franklin grew up in an era when there weren't a lot of people talking about the free will of salvation. And so he writes, Ezra Stiles says, no one's ever asked me this before. He says, and it's not a question that should be answered lightly. If someone's going to say Jesus is or isn't divine, they should have done the research, and I've never done the research. He said, but I can tell you what I believe. That there is a God, one God, the creator of the universe, that he rewards the good, he punishes the wicked, that there is an afterlife, and that he's given us the Old and New Testament by divine revelation as a guide for which we should live. But as to whether Jesus was truly the Son of God or just the best prophet we've ever had, I don't know. Now, at that point, You can't argue Franklin's a deist. Franklin's the same guy at the Constitutional Convention when everything's falling apart. He's the one that suggests we should pray and ask for God's help. Franklin believes in a God that intervenes in man, but he's not sure about Jesus. But I also think it's super possible. Now, like with a month and a half left, the Holy Spirit's like, look it up real quick. Right? You should check this out. I think it's totally possible. But the reason I point this out is that when people make these blanket accusations, well, the founding fathers, they weren't really Christians, atheists, agnostics, deists. There's very few that fall into any of those categories by any level of definition. And upon further study, I don't think really any of them, you might have like a guy like Thomas Paine, but Thomas Paine, he was not an atheist, agnostic, or deist. He believed in God, but he hated Christianity. Now, I know that could be like a dichotomy on some level, but the bottom line is it's a different story than a lot of what we've been told or heard. And again, this is where I would point to. If we're saying these weren't people that believed in God, then why were they praying all the time? Let me back you up. As the American Revolution unfolds, this happens on 15 different occasions from the Continental Congress, where they're calling on the nation to a time of prayer. And there were two kinds of prayer proclamations. One was for prayer and fasting. One was for prayer and thanksgiving. And it's not unusual this would happen. If you need to see God move, the Bible talks about, right, with prayer and fasting, you can take your request to the Lord. And they were like, well, we should pray and fast. We should do this. But the Bible also gives an indication. If you've prayed and asked for God to do something and God has intervened or answered your request, what should your response be? You go back and tell God, thank you. So they said, we didn't have a day of prayer and thanksgiving. And this is the way it went back and forth in the revolution. The very first call to prayer was a call to prayer and fasting. And by the way, all of these prayer and fasting proclamations are available online. It's not that this stuff is not historically known and documented. It's that it's not taught. And so people don't even know to look for it. They don't know it's there, but you literally can get online. You can read these proclamations if you know to look for them. Well, this very first one of prayer and fasting, it wasn't long after it happened that John Adams wrote Abigail another letter. And I've cited John and Abigail Adams letters a lot. Part of the reason strategically is I want to make it easy when people listen that you don't have to remember a lot of places to go. Just go read John and Abigail Adams letters, right? Like they talked about almost all of this. In their time from the revolution to the end of their life, they wrote 1,100 letters back and forth. Okay. There's books, and that's a lot of writing letters. And depending on like your flavor of styles of books and stories and movies, if you are someone that likes the Hallmark Channel, you would love their letters. John Adams was a hopeless romantic. Abigail Adams, brilliant lady, obviously into romance. But like John Adams has a letter where he starts off and he's like, Abigail, I'm about to suffocate because I haven't seen you in a week and a half and you are the air that I breathe. Right? And you're like, all right, bro, it's getting a little thick. Right? But this is their relationship, right? So anyway, a lot of great stuff in their letters, but he writes her and says, Abigail, it's amazing what's happened. We've been praying and asking for God to move. And in this letter, he goes through and documents like thing after thing after thing. He talks about that the British attacked this fort we had. And we were able to repel the British and we defended the fort and saved the town. And then we had this militia that went and attacked a British fort and we took the British fort from them. Like it was crazy. And as he's writing this, you also have to keep in the context in mind that Great Britain's the number one military power in the world. And we're this ragtag nobodies, right? I mean, to say that we were rednecks with guns is also misleading because I think like rednecks today probably shoot and are maybe better trained than some of like the people back then would have been, right? So it's a little misleading. However, this is basically the equivalent, right? He's just, hey, everybody get your guns, come on down, we're going to do this thing. And he's like, this is crazy. We're actually having victories. Well, then he goes on in this letter and says that we actually just had this naval encounter and we destroyed a 64-gun British man of warship and a 20-gun British man of warship. Now, those were naval vessels. One of them had 64 cannons, one had 20 cannons on it. And this is even more impressive because we didn't have an army yet. We had militias. I get that. We didn't have a navy yet either. What we had were businessmen with boats. And we took whatever boats we had, we'd take whatever cannons we could find, and we'd put them on the boats to fight back. But these are not like naval frigate fighting vessels. We're building them at the time, but they're not built yet. So we're doing whatever we can to fight back. Why this is even more impressive, if you ever go to Washington, D.C., the Smithsonian Museum of American History, up on the third floor, they have one of the very first ships of the American Navy. It's called the Gunboat Philadelphia. This is the American Navy, and John Adams like, Abigail, it's incredible. We just destroyed a British warship with 64 cannons and 20 cannons, and my question is like, how? Did you row really fast in their direction? Right? This is the reality. Now, again, in fairness, I'm saying this as a joke, right? They were working really hard, strategy and doing, but they recognize something. Like, it doesn't make sense that our little nothing dinghy, right, is taking out these massive ships. And John Adams writes Abigail another letter where he says, I was eating dinner tonight. There were men at a table eating dinner behind me. And they were discussing these unlikely things we've been seeing happen. And they were trying to figure out what's the best explanation for this. And they're coming up with all these ideas. And then one of the men stopped them and said, no. This is what's happening. And John writes Abigail what the guy said and said, I think it is the best explanation I've heard so far. Here's what the guy interrupted, the best explanation John Adams heard. Here's what he said. It appears to me the eternal Son of God is operating powerfully against the British nation. Right? When people are like, how is this happening? The guy's like, oh, I got it. It's Jesus. That's how it's happening. Now, let me again point out, to have an answer like that, this is not coming from people that are like separation of church and state. Okay? This is coming from people that knew if we don't have God's intervention, we will never succeed, which is why they were praying and fasting and asking God to intervene. And then they recognize when these things are happening, it has to be because God's helping us. Like, this is all that makes sense. Now, this letter was in 1777. So this is early stages of the revolution, and they're already seeing these things that are like obvious to them. Well, what are they already seeing? Let me walk you through just a couple of examples of what they're already seeing. Again, very well historically documented, just not always historically talked about. But let me show you some of these. If you go just like 2 months after the Declaration of Independence is presented to the American public, July 4th, you have the Battle of Long Island. It's up in New York. At this point, the British, recognizing the Americans are being rebellious and they're separating, the British send over far more of their force. And as they do, there's about 30,000 plus British troops that show up. And this is actually a map done by a British historian about the Battle of Long Island. It was also known as the Battle of Brooklyn Heights. If you want to look it up later, you can look it up for either one of those. But there were about 30,000 British soldiers. There were 9,000 American soldiers. They're on the island in New York. The British have marched the Americans and pinned them back against the river. The river's a mile wide, so they're stuck. In the midst of them being stuck, the British Navy then begins sailing up the river. And once the British Navy gets behind them, you are totally encircled. There's nowhere you're going. They're all going to be captured. All the officers are probably going to be killed. George Washington is there. He's for sure going to be killed, hung publicly for treason. All the stuff's going to happen. This is the end of the revolution. Except on a sunny day, as the Navy is sailing up the river, here's where the miracles begin. Out of nowhere, and this is historically documented, even the British historians identified this, out of nowhere, a massive storm blows in, but the storm is blowing down the river. It literally starts blowing the Navy frigates out into the bay. So out of the river, blowing them back out. And as this storm is happening, there's also captains like, guys, we're getting pushed in the rocks. Turn around, get out of here quick before we wreck these vessels and we lose them. And so they literally have to call this retreat to get the naval vessels back. Well, that doesn't really solve the problem of getting Washington off the island. And Washington knows, well, as soon as the storm stops, they're going to sail right back. We're going to be surrounded again. We have to get off this island. And so that night, he sent out word to go find anything that floats. And this was also important because at that time in American history, most Americans did not know how to swim. That was not a normal thing back then. And even if you could swim, going a mile across a river, you got to be an impressive swimmer to do that anyway. So he says, find anything that floats. And they did. And so they start coming back with canoes and flat bottom boats, whatever they can find. And they begin the evacuation that night. Well, there's 9,000 of them they have to get off this island. And there's only so many people you get on a canoe at a time, right? On this flat bottom boat. And you got to row across and row back and across and back. And they're doing this all night. But they don't have enough night to get all the people across. So as the morning is coming, there's more than 1,000 of them still left. And George Washington is still there. George Washington committed that he wasn't going to leave until all the men were off because he wanted to make sure all of his men were protected. You can imagine some of the guys were probably pushing back like, sir, we got to get you off this. Like the privates, we can lose them. We can't lose our commander. You're important. But he said, no, that's not the kind of leader I'm going to be. I'm going to make sure my men are safe, that I'm getting off. It's also one of many examples of why his men loved him so much, right? Why George Washington was such an incredible leader on so many levels. But Washington is there. There's now 1,000 of them. They're now outnumbered 30,000 to 1,000. Well, as soon as the light shows up, the British are going to see they're evacuating. They're going to charge. Now they're for sure going to be captured and killed. This is the end of it. Except before the light of dawn appears, something else unusual happened. There was a fog that lifted up off the river, not totally unusual, except the fog was really thick, and the fog blew in off the river, and the fog settled between both camps. So that as the light shows up, the British can't see anything, and so they have no idea what is happening. In fact, one of the guys who was there, Major Benjamin Talmadge, he's the guy that went on to become the head of the Culper spy ring, one of the more famous spy rings of the American Revolution. This is what, he was there that morning. This is what he said about that morning from his records. A very dense fog began to rise, and it seemed to settle in a peculiar manner over both encampments. I recollect this peculiar providential occurrence perfectly well, and so very dense was the atmosphere that I could scarcely discern a man at 6 yards distance. Right? So from me to the front row, he's like, I couldn't even see anybody. The fog was so thick. And by the way, if you haven't picked up any parallels yet, I'm going to tell a couple of these stories. And it's just fascinating to me how some of this parallels some of the miracles we read about in Scripture. Right? Where this superior force is coming against them and they're stuck at the water and they can't do anything. And I mean, there's some interesting parallels from Scripture. Nonetheless, they continue the evacuation. When they load the last 3 ships, they get to the middle of the river and the fog lifts. The British realize the camp is empty. They charge the camp. The British identified. When they got to the edge of the water, they looked and they saw 3 boats unload on the other side by their own acknowledgement. They're watching George Washington get out of the boat on the other side of the river. God had saved the Americans, not giving them a victory in this moment, but keeping them alive to fight another day. Now, as this happens, people could have looked at this and been like, all right, now tell me that story again. So you're telling me it was a sunny day? The Navy's coming up and the storm comes and it blows the Navy out and then the storm stays and then the night falls and you guys find these things, but you're never going to make it in time. And then a fog comes and it's between both camps and the fog stays the last 3 boats and it lifts and you get across. You are the luckiest group there's ever been, right? Understand, there would be people that would try to explain this away. And if this was the only time something like this happened, you might be able to explain it away. Or at least people would try to justify it that way. The problem was this kind of stuff started happening over and over and over where people were going, okay, I think God's actually helping, right? I think something's happening here. Well, again, they didn't get a victory here, but God kept them providentially, divinely kept them alive in this moment through his hand of protection. Well, when you get to the end of that year, December 1776, the Americans have not really done anything significant, not had any major victories, and really they've had a lot of major losses. And from these major defeats, starting with the Battle of Long Island from August to December, they lose the Battle of Kips Bay. They then lose the Battle of White Plains. They lose the Battle of Fort Washington. They lose the Battle of Fort Lee. They lose all of New York. So all they've done is lose the whole time. And then Washington has a unique challenge that in December, back then there was 1-year enlistments in the Continental Army. And the enlistments, no matter when you started, if you signed up in January, February, March, April, your enlistment was to December 31st of that year. So Washington has only lost battles the whole time. December is here, and he's got to try to get people to sign up for round 2. Okay? I'm from Dallas, Fort Worth. This is like me being like, guys, let's cheer for the Cowboys in the playoffs. It's going to be great. And you're like, you're a moron, right? We're not, that's ridiculous. Right. You don't cheer for the team that never wins. This is crazy. This is George Washington. And it's also worth noting, morale is at an all-time low because all they've done is lose. And there's people already deserting because they're in winter quarters. There's people going, wait a second. I left my family, my kids at home. I'm in a tent without proper shelter, without good food. I could go home with my family, be warm, have a fire, be better fed. What am I doing here? People were deserting. And then he's like, no, guys, really, we need people to sign up, and nobody wants to sign up. This is his dilemma. And this is why he comes up with a plan. And really, he had to come up with something, and he came up with a pretty great plan. His plan was on Christmas night, we are going to cross over the Delaware. There was a close fort, Trenton, where the Hessians were. He says, we're going to march on Trenton and we have this victory. And his idea was they were going to bring a superior force, overwhelming force. Trenton had between 12 and 1,500 of the Hessians. The Hessians were German mercenaries fighting on Team British, right? But they're Germans hired by the British to fight. And so Washington's idea was, well, if we take like 6, 7, 8,000 people, superior force, we can get a victory, but then we have a victory. Everybody's got a good taste in their mouth. And they're like, maybe we can do it. Like, sign up for round 2. This is his idea. Now, why in the world would you go on Christmas night? Historians have discussed and debated this for a while. And there's a couple of thoughts and ideas. And some historians give more credence to than other, but I think it's worth noting. In America, Christmas was illegal to celebrate until almost the Civil War. It's interesting. Why? Because what had happened over in so many European nations is they had taken what used to be these holy days and they had turned them into really arguably quite pagan celebrations. And they lost the true meaning of what the holy day was about. Now, I know in America we'd never commercialize Christmas so much we'd lose the spirit of what it's about. But this is why in early America, we didn't celebrate Christmas. But Germany was one of those European nations that did. And the Germans were known. If there's going to be a celebration, we're going to really celebrate this thing. Now, I can just tell you, if you are under the impression that the other military might have an evening of celebration and you're like, you know what, if we're going to have to pick a fight, let's wait till they're unconscious. I feel like that improves their odds. It's not a bad military strategy, just like as a thought. But Washington's idea is they're going to march on Trenton on Christmas night and they're going to be there the next morning when the sun rises. They're going to be in position. They're going to surprise them. It's going to be great. This is his idea. What they did not take into full effect, or what they did not take into full account, was the impact and effects of the weather. Because as they get ready to go and they're going to cross the Delaware, their idea is they're going to have a midnight crossing. So we're going to be across by midnight. That mattered because then once they get across, they still have several miles they got to march. So they're going to get all their troops across by midnight. And General Henry Knox is the guy who was in charge of the crossing where Washington was. I say that because I'm going to come back and mention a letter from him in just a second. But Washington's idea was we're going to there's 3 crossing locations. And when we cross these 3 locations, we're going to take 5,400 troops. We're taking the cannons and the horses. Everybody's going to go. We're going to get across by midnight. Once we get across, we have this 9-mile march we got to make to get to Trenton, but we'll be able to get there, get set up in time before sun rises. It's going to be great. What they did not, again, take into account was how bad the weather was. And 2 of the locations, actually all 3 locations, the fog was so thick they could not see the other side of the river. In all 3 locations, there was major ice chunks floating down the river, but in 2 of the locations, when they tried to get boats in the water, their boats got pushed so many miles down the river before they finally got across that they called it off. They're like, it's not going to work. We can't get people across. The only location they got anybody across was the one where Washington was. Washington didn't know that yet, and even where he was, he only got 2,400 troops across. They didn't get across till 4 a.m. And when he gets across, he realizes nobody else made it. We're by ourselves. Now, this is a tough decision as a leader. When you thought you're taking this overwhelming superior numerical force, and you need it, by the way, against the more professional guys you're going up against, and they're not going to have that number anymore, he says, we still got to have a victory. We just got to do what we got to do. And so they decide, okay, we're going to continue on. And their idea was, we're just going to continue to advance all night in secrecy. The problem is you're never going to make it before the light of dawn because you're taking horses and cannons and equipment and supplies. You got a 9-mile march. You're not showing up before people are able to see. They're going to see you coming. They're going to have perimeters. The plan's not going to work as is. But one of the unexpected things, it ended up being a blessing, didn't feel like a blessing in the moment, was as they are doing this 9-mile march, a blizzard rolls in on them. Now, a blizzard does not feel like a blessing to anybody in this moment. In fact, if you study any kind of history of the Continental Army, American Revolution, when you signed up in the military, you were given a uniform, but you were given no winter gear. You had one uniform. And if you wore holes in it, it had holes in it. By the time we got to winter, even the British historians identified the British could track the movement of the American soldiers in winter by tracking their bloody footprints in the snow. Because there were already many troops who had worn through their boots, didn't have shoes, or even barefoot wrapping some kind of cloth around to try to keep their feet protected. Brutal conditions. And so they don't have any winter gear. A blizzard rolls in on them, and actually, it was identified that there were actually 2 men that froze to death in these conditions. And the historic documents on this don't give us a lot of details other than the 2 men died by freezing in these conditions. I can only speculate that if you're not dressed well and a blizzard rolls in, right, these guys are probably like, guys, I'm so tired. Let me just sit down for a second. They just want to rest for a minute. But if you slow down at all and you're not prepared, you probably aren't getting up, and they didn't. Well, this is miserable. And you can imagine while you're there going, God, what are you doing? This is the worst. What they did not know is that not only were they dealing with the blizzard was at Trenton as well. And the sentries on duty, they actually went to their commanding officer and said, hey, nobody's going to be out here doing operation this kind of weather. Can we please come in and stay warm by the fire? And their commanding officer agreed. Nobody's crazy enough to be out here. You guys come on and stay warm. They are never going to make it before the light of dawn appears. But now there's nobody watching the road. There's nobody even watching the perimeter of the fort. So they literally walk up, get on perimeter, edge of the fort. They're blockading the road so nobody's coming and going. And when they get in position, when they finally get there and announce themselves, it was a complete surprise to the Hessians. What's crazier about this complete surprise? The Hessians are inside a fort with supplies. When Americans announce themselves, the Hessians abandon the fort and they start running in all directions. Now, I'm not saying quite like Gideon's army moment. I'm just saying, like, it's crazy the level of insanity that fell on them. Now, some historians argue, well, maybe they didn't know where the Americans were and they thought they'd come out and flank them. All they did was run out in front of lines of guys with muskets. And we're just like mowing these guys down. It was so crazy that, again, they were in an entrenched position, fortified with supplies. They could have been there a long time. This battle was over in 35 minutes. Okay? Now, to give you even perspective of how crazy this battle was, at the end of the battle, now remember, this is the Hessians and the Americans, but the Hessians are on Team British. So on Team British, there were approximately 20 killed, approximately 100 wounded, and approximately 1,000 that were captured. On the American side, there were 3 wounded. Period. That's it. Right? And they're going, well, that went way better than we thought. Right? Like, we did not see this coming. That went really well. Oh, it gets crazier. Because of the 3 that were wounded, when they come marching into Trenton, Washington sent these small detachments, one specifically, that went to the edge of town because they wanted to make sure that no loyalists could go to alert the British to send reinforcements back. And so they said, make sure nobody leaves. So they're going to the edge of town. As they pass a little farmhouse, there's a dog that starts barking. And as this dog is barking, there's a guy that comes to the door and he's got this musket. What's going on? And they say, sir, we mean you no harm. We, part of the Continental Army, we're doing an operation on Trenton. You stay inside. We're blockading the road. Nobody can come and go, but no harm will come to any civilians. He says, no, wait a second. If you're doing something, he says, I'm Team Patriots. His name was Dr. John Riker. He says, I'm a doctor and some poor fellow may need my assistance. He got his medical kit. He joined the detachment. When the firing starts, this detachment comes and they join the side as it's happening. Well, there were a couple officers of note in this. The officer in charge of the small detachment, as he's leading his men in, he gets shot. Now, not critically, but he's shot enough that, okay, he's out. So now the next young officer steps up, and as he steps up, he gets shot in the shoulder, but it comes in and nicks an artery, and he's bleeding out. But it just so happens there's a doctor standing right beside him. And the doctor literally takes his finger, puts in the hole, like giving orders. We're going to save this. He saves his guy's life. Well, what's more interesting is not just that he saved a guy's life. It's also interesting that, like, who was this guy? If you ever see the famous painting of Washington crossing Delaware, he's the guy standing behind George Washington. That is a known individual. By the way, all the people in that painting are known individuals, or at least identified on some level. But this guy was very well known, so well known, he became the 5th president of the United States. His name was James Monroe. And this is, again, where people are like, okay, so you're telling me that you guys are walking out and the one dog that barked was at the doctor, and the doctor came with you, and like, he's the one guy that gets shot critically, fatally, like he's there finger in the hole, like, that's a huge coincidence. And they're like, no, that was God. right? In these moments, look what God did. And this was the kind of stuff they begin to see. In fact, everybody who was there identified this. George Washington, when he wrote about this victory, he talked about how Providence had overseen what they had done. But I mentioned earlier, General Henry Knox was the guy that was there at the crossing helping get everything done. This is what General Knox wrote about that day. He said, the hurry, fright, and confusion of the enemy was not unlike that which will be when the last trump will sound. Right? Just like chaos. Nobody knows what's happening right now. He said, Providence seemed to have smiled upon every part of this enterprise. Everybody who was there knew that God showed up and they could not have done it without God. And this is what is very consistent in their writings. In fact, even as the revolution goes on, in 1778, George Washington writes that General Thomas Nelson Jr., he was a signer of the Declaration from Virginia. They were very good friends. And Washington actually writes him and is telling him, it's crazy how much we are seeing in the revolution and how much God has done for us. And he draws an observation in this letter. Here's his observation. He said, the hand of providence has been so conspicuous in all this that he must be worse than an infidel that lacks faith and more than wicked that has not gratitude enough to acknowledge his obligations. Washington says, if anybody sees what we've seen, if they can't acknowledge God's hand in this, they must be worse than a non-believer or more than wicked to not acknowledge God. But his next line is my favorite. He says, but it will be time enough for me to turn preacher when my present appointment ceases, and therefore I shall add no more on the doctrine of providence. When Washington's like, I've seen enough miracles, I can become a pastor. But for right now, I'm going to try to win this war, right? Now, let me also point out, he talked about how clear the hand of providence was in the revolution. If there was anybody that understood God's hand in battle, it was George Washington. Because if you know his story, let me back you up. Because when America's still part of a British colony, back when we had the French and Indian War, my favorite story of George Washington is from the Battle of the Monongahela. It's where he got the title of being a bulletproof guy. But 1755, the French and the British are fighting for control over the Ohio Valley Territory. And at this point, 23-year-old Colonel Washington is brought on General Braddock's staff as he joins General Braddock. General Braddock leads the troops. They're going to try to drive the French from the region. But on their way, General Braddock leads them into an ambush. Now, General Braddock had the superior force, but having no understanding at all of fighting in any kind of wooded theater. He's used to European theater, where it's open fields. And everybody lying shoulder to shoulder, they were ambushed in a valley. So there's French and Indians on both sides shooting into them. And he told all his men, get shoulder to shoulder, men, and lines them up in the valley. So literally, the French are just like, point your gun, pull, we're good. I mean, it's a massacre. Every single officer was shot off horseback. And when General Braddock was finally shot, at that point, Washington was able to take command. When Washington took command, Washington is the only officer that had not been shot down off horseback. But he had 2 horses shot off from under him. But he's now this young officer. He's the only one left alive. And he recognizes, being the woodsman that he was from Virginia, having navigated, had many friends that were Indians and had fought Indians many times. And so he knew exactly what to do. He said, we're in a terrible situation. Let's get out of here. He leads the retreat. But when Washington leads the retreat, because the caravan that they were taking initially to go drive out the French, it was a 4-mile-long caravan. So they have all these wagons and cannons and everything else. And they're trying not to abandon everything, even though the British were like, leave it all behind. And so there are people that are way in front of Washington. He's trying to get as much as they can back as he's trying to be the leader now. When he gets back to the fort, word has already gone ahead, and word has spread that every single officer was killed in this endeavor. And he finds out that there's already been a letter sent to his mom telling her that he's dead. So he has to write her a letter, right? It's like, Mom, the tales of my death were greatly exaggerated. I'm still here. But here's part of what he writes her in this letter. He says, I now exist and appear in the land of the living by the miraculous care of providence that protected me beyond all human probability or expectation. I had 4 bullets through my coat and 2 horses shot under me, yet escaped unhurt. Now, let me back up for a second. I don't want to skip over this and miss it. I had 4 bullets through my coat. Now, some of us were used to wearing coats. If I got 4 bullet holes in my coat, the odds that I got 4 bullet holes in my body are pretty high, right? For you to open up and be like, well, where did that come from? What in the world? That's Washington. Bullets through his coat, no mark on his body. Okay? It gets even more impressive. Because Washington, as he goes on with his life, a lot of things are happening, but this is before the Revolution, 1770. Let me back up. So General Samuel Davies, he's one of the evangelists, noted evangelists from the First Great Awakening. He was from Virginia, and he preached a sermon not long after this event. The sermon was Religion and Patriotism, the Constituents of a Good Soldier. And he was talking about how, a little bit like with King David and some of the men from Scripture, how God can anoint people for war and gift them, and what are the boundaries and standards, and if you are in the military, what's the expectation, and it's really a good biblical thought in the sermon, but he has a little asterisk in this sermon to give an example of this. This is literally part of the sermon. You see the asterisk down here, and here's what he said. He said, as a remarkable instance of this, I may point out to the public that heroic young Colonel Washington, whom I cannot but hope Providence has hitherto preserved, and so signal a manner for some important service to his country. He literally in the sermon says, guys, I just heard this crazy story about God protecting somebody in the middle of battle. He says, we might want to watch this kid. Because if God protects somebody like that, God's probably got a pretty big plan for them in their life. Right now, it's really interesting that he's making this observation, but let me jump forward. Because in 1770, George Washington is with Dr. Craig, one of his lifelong friends, and they go back to the same area. They're camping out, and it's not far from where they had initially been. And one night when they're there, there's a group of these Indian chiefs that come to the fire. And as they come in, they say, we are here to meet this man over there. And they come to George Washington. And this first chief steps forward and says, okay, you don't know me. But about 15 years ago, we were in these woods together. He said, I knew when we were fighting the British, if we could kill the officers, we could scatter the troops and none would escape from us. I told my braves to single out every officer and kill every officer, and you were the last one left. So I told all my braves, turn and fire at him. This is where it picks up. Here's what he said. I called to my young men and said, quick, let your aim be certain. And he dies. Our rifles were leveled, rifles which, but for you, knew not how to miss. 'Twas all in vain. A power mightier far than we shielded you. I am come to pay homage to the man who is a particular favorite of heaven and can never die in battle. Okay? There was another Indian chief. And the other Indian chief is telling Dr. Craig, he's like, I had to come, because they're asking him, what's your story? He says, I had to come meet this guy. And here's part of what he told Dr. Craig. He says, Washington was never born to be killed by a bullet. I had 17 fair fires at him with my rifle, and after all, could not bring him to the ground. When you have the entire enemy aiming at you, right, and you don't get scratched, this is crazy. Now, a couple of interesting thoughts about this, because their observations of Washington was he was never born to be killed by a bullet and he can never die in battle. Well, he did not die in battle. He was not killed by a bullet, but if you even jump forward to the American Revolution, one of the crazy things about him is when the Americans and British were fighting, there were times Washington on his horse would ride between both lines firing to encourage it. Like, that's the stupidest place to be. And I say that with the love of Jesus. That is a stupid place to be. What are you doing? He wanted to encourage his men and rally them. That you don't put yourself there, except, right? If you have the hand of God protecting you, the safest place to be is where the hand of God is, not necessarily where men's wisdom will lead you. But let me point out, see, what Samuel Davies pointed out about him is, you know what, somebody might want to watch this guy. Because and if you want to see more of the story, we do have the whole story told. It's also footnoted. You can go back and see some of these things. Really cool stuff. But Samuel Davies in his sermon, notice his conclusion was, Providence has hitherto preserved for some important service to his country. When God saves somebody in a really interesting way, you might not think God's not done with that person. Now, I don't know how many people were paying attention, right? But literally, when that happened, I was like, I can't guarantee he's going to be president. But God has a purpose for him, or he wouldn't have turned his head. Right? Now, let me just, again, back up. George Washington is a guy who says, if you know the story, you can't deny that God was a part. Well, I don't know how deep Trump's faith is, but there's no doubt from his inaugural speech when he says that God saved me on purpose. God saved me for a reason. God is doing something, and this is big picture. God is on the move in this nation. It's so cool to see. And I know there are all kinds of different flavors of states. There's all kinds of different colors. And sometimes it can be a challenge where we are to see the opposition and the momentum. And I get it. But big picture, God is on the move and God is doing something in the midst of what's going on. And let me go back to American Revolution, because even as the American Revolution is going on, in 1781, you have the last major battle, the Battle of Yorktown. This is where, ultimately, when we defeat the British at Yorktown, it kind of marked the end of the revolution, especially militarily. It really led to a separation of us and Great Britain. And one of the things that was a policy from Great Britain, is that it actually goes back to King James. When King James came out with the King James Bible, it actually led to him banning the Geneva Bible. Now, part of why he banned the Geneva Bible is because there was commentary in the Geneva Bible that were critical about the king and the practice of the king. And he's like, nobody speaks against the king. And they banned the Geneva Bible, but they didn't stop there. In 1619, they determined that you are not allowed to print any Bibles or religious commentary without having an official printing license authorized and approved by the king. And the king refused to authorize any American printer to print any Bibles or commentary in the English language. But the guy who was the official printer of Congress and they were in proclamations, his name was Robert Aiken, right? He was the guy who said, hey, so going to Congress. And it's also worth noting context that in 1777, there was a resolution brought to Congress to import 20,000 Bibles from Holland or some friendly nation because the Bible was the number one textbook used in schools to teach kids how to read, and we needed more Bibles because we had more kids going to school. And Congress actually agreed. They said, we do need more Bibles. They agreed, approved, and authorized the importation of more because the revolution, it never really happened because of the way the war worked and all that was going on. And so 1781, Robert Aiken says, okay, guys, we've had a Bible shortage for a while. I know we have. So I've been working on a project. I didn't want to tell anybody because I don't want to get in trouble. I feel like it's a moment to talk to you about it. What do you think about me maybe printing a Bible in English in America? And of course, right, this is where, as Congress did probably what Congress would do today. They're like, let's assign a committee to that. Let's get some oversight. Now, they assign a committee, and the committee says, we're going to do a Bible. We need to make sure it's a good translation, and it's done well, because it'd be super embarrassing if, like, the first thing we did, we'd all these, like, mistranslated, miscommunicated, misspelled words, whatever else. They choose 2 theologians, 2 pastors that knew Greek, Hebrew, and Latin, so they could track and make sure it's a good translation. And so the committee reviews it, the 2 theologians review it. They come back to the committee. They're like, he did a really good job. Committee goes back to Congress and says, he did a great job. So Congress then authorizes and approves this. Now, as this is happening, this is also where, and this is right before you get to the Battle of Yorktown, but this is kind of in that same era. So you get the Battle of Yorktown, 1781. Well, then in 1782, this is the Bible that is printed. This is an original Aiken Bible. It was really cool. Somebody's mentioning it a minute ago. This is one of the originals. There were about 10,000 printed. There's only a couple of dozen left in known existence today. The majority of them belong to the Library of Congress or the Smithsonian, but this is an actual Aiken Bible. And what's so unique about this Bible, many things, but in the front cover of this Bible, and it's known as the Aiken Bible because it has Robert Aiken's name on the front. He's the guy that printed it, the printer of Congress. It's also known as a Bible of the Revolution. You can look it up using either one of those terms. But in the front of it, it actually has the report from the committee, but then it has an actual endorsement from Congress. The United States and Congress assembled to recommend this edition of the Bible to inhabitants of the United States. Congress literally is responsible for approving, authorizing, endorsing the first Bible that was printed in English in America. And if you go back and check the records, part of what the records say when Robert Aiken went to ask Congress if he could do this, the records of Congress, what he told them is, we have a Bible shortage in schools, and if you let me do this Bible could be, quote, a neat edition of the Holy Scriptures for the use of schools. This is the actual handwritten records of Congress where it shows a neat edition of the Holy Scriptures for the use of schools, and Congress agreed and approved it. The first Bible printed in English in America was printed so our kids would know what the Word of God said. Well, that's fascinating, right? But But this is just a sampling of part of the influence of the Bible, faith, and Christianity is there. In fact, if you go to the end of the revolution, when the revolution finally ended, it was 1783. These are the three guys that signed the Peace Treaty of Paris, what ended the revolution. On the left is John Jay, in the middle is John Adams, on the right is Benjamin Franklin. These are the guys that signed the document that made America a free and independent nation, that brought peace between us and Great Britain. If you look on the left, you see the top left, there's Article 10, because there's 10 articles. The bottom left, you have the signatures. That's David Hartley, then John Adams, then Benjamin Franklin, then John Jay. What's the most remarkable thing about this document? Again, historically well known, it's just people don't really talk about it. Look at the title of this document. In the name of the most holy and undivided Trinity. Do you know America became a nation in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit? Because that is the holy undivided Trinity. Now, that is also the weirdest title for a peace treaty I've ever heard of. Why in the world are you choosing that as your title? Well, it could be that somebody had read Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 at some point, right? In all your ways, acknowledge him. They literally put his name on the top of the document that made America a nation. Okay? It's still on display today in Washington, D.C. It's just that nobody talks about it. Nobody shows it. And this, again, is my point, is if we go back and look, when John Adams wrote Thomas Jefferson in 1813, and he said, the principles of Christianity were the principles upon which we achieved independence. Well, if you actually studied history from original documents, you'd be like, oh, I totally see that. I totally see that America only became a nation because of the influence of Christianity, the influence of the Bible, the influence of pastors. It's so obvious. And by the way, it wasn't just obvious in their time. It's been obvious for most of American history, so much so that literally almost every president talked about this. You have people like Woodrow Wilson. If you don't know Woodrow Wilson, he was a very bad man. He was not a good president. I'm not putting it up there to brag on him, right? Don't be misled by this. But even Woodrow Wilson, this incredibly racist bad guy, Woodrow Wilson said, America was born a Christian nation. America was born to exemplify that devotion to the elements of righteousness which are derived from the revelation of Holy Scripture. Well, then you have people like Richard Nixon. Again, somebody with his own problems. I'm not denying that either. But Richard Nixon also acknowledged that, let us remember, as a Christian nation, we have a charge and a destiny. Notice they're saying America is a Christian nation. Okay? Just notice this for a minute. And not only do they acknowledge Christian nation, you're going to see many of them talk about the Bible and the necessity or the need of the Bible. For example, Franklin Roosevelt, FDR, he acknowledged in the formative days of the Republic, the directing influence the Bible exercised upon the fathers of the nation is conspicuously evident. That means obvious. He's saying if you studied history, it would be so obvious that they were impacted by the Bible. I would challenge you could read nearly any textbook today, and you would find no indication that our nation was impacted by the Bible, that our founding fathers were impacted by the Bible. Now, he was a long time ago, but not that long ago. I mean, you're talking the 1940s, right? I mean, again, that's a long time ago. It's not that long ago. And that's how much our education has changed, that back then everybody knew. Well, of course, the Bible influenced him. In fact, he continued. He said, we cannot read the history of our rise and development as a nation without reckoning with the place the Bible has occupied in shaping the advances of the Republic. He said, you can't read a history book and not see how the Bible is what helped us to take step after step after step. Again, you could read nearly any textbook today and you would not see any kind of indication of that. This is a president, right? This isn't like a Christian advocate. This is a president acknowledging that. You also have people like Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan acknowledged, of the many influences that have shaped the United States of America into a distinctive nation and people, none may be said to be more fundamental and enduring than the Bible. There's been nothing more impactful on our nation than the Bible. In another speech he identified, if we ever forget that we're one nation under God, then we'll be a nation gone under. This is what's been the challenge and danger for the last many decades. We've never been as secular as a nation as we are now. It's quite interesting. But it's also interesting that we've never seen a rebirth and regrowth across the country like we are seeing right now, where God is on the move and people's eyes are being opened. And the fact that God has chosen someone like President Trump to be part of this story, which a lot of people also, I think we misread our Bible so many times. When we look at someone like President Trump and we're like, that guy's got a lot of problems. And I'm always like, have you read Hebrews 11 recently? Right? Like, I feel like maybe you only have like the kids' Sunday school version of some of our heroes of the faith. Because if you go back and read the real story, like, President Trump is one of the most Hebrews 11 kind of people ever. right? If he's not a Samson kind of character, I don't know who is. Okay? This is interesting because God chose some of the most flawed people, the people we would never choose to be our pastor, that God chose to be political leaders. It's fascinating. Okay? But let me go back and show you a few more examples. Andrew Jackson, a guy who, again, lots of issues in his life. He had some good things too. Was great as a military guy. Was really not great as a president. He gets credit for balancing the budget, which really a lot of that goes back to what James Monroe started with tariffs and a lot of things that happened that he enjoyed the benefit of. Not that he didn't do a good job in some areas, but he, again, was a really racist guy. He laid the foundation for what became the Trail of Tears. He was very pro-slavery, the founder of the Democrat Party, a lot of issues with him. But he did get saved toward the very end of his life. That's good news. But even while he was not a Christian, he still acknowledged this about America. He said, the Bible is the rock upon which our republic rests. Why has America been the most stable, free, prosperous nation in the history of the world? Because we built on the right foundation. Because when you build on the rock, right, though the storm come, right, the rains, when you're on the right foundation, you stand when it happens. Even guys like Harry Truman acknowledge this. Harry Truman said, this is a Christian nation, and this great country of ours has been demonstrated the fundamental unity of Christianity and democracy. I just want to point out, every single president in the history of our nation acknowledged America as a Christian nation until President Obama was the first one to say we're not a Christian nation. He actually apologized for being a Christian nation. Joe Biden has not talked about us being a Christian nation, and it's, again, there's levels of irony. When God chooses to use someone like a Donald Trump to once again acknowledge some level of Christian values or encouraging people to find faith and go back to the Bible, it's so interesting because this is not the way we would have written the story, but it's just interesting the way this unfolded. But again, the reason I want to point this out is as we kind of wrap some of these thoughts together, George Washington laid all this out at the end of his presidency. He delivered the most significant political address any president's ever given in his farewell address. And in his farewell address, he gave lots of great advice we've forgotten today about avoiding debt because you could be enslaved through debt, about not loving party more than you loved policy or more than you love principle more than you love party. A lot of really, really good thoughts he gave. But the one to me that's the most significant, he said, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity. Now, just to give context, we're talking about political prosperity. So how as a nation can you thrive politically? How can you do that? He said this, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. Indispensable means you can't do without. Here's what's interesting. Of all of the advice he gave, there's only one time he said, we will never succeed without this. It's interesting. The only thing he said, this is indispensable. Everything else, like this is my advice, this one you have to have. It's indispensable. He then went even further. He said, in vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars. Everybody that opposes religion and morality. And by the way, when they say religion and morality, they're not arbitrary about religion. It's not like whatever religion you want. No, they're very specific about Christianity. When they say morality, they're talking about the morals of the Bible. What they're saying is without Christianity in the Bible, this isn't going to work. And anybody that opposes that doesn't love America. Right? Because that's what a patriot is. Patriotism. You love your country. Well, if you love your country, you want the best for it. Well, how do you get the best for it? Through Christianity and the Bible. Now, this is not the only time the sentiment was expressed. This was actually echoed so much by the founding fathers. In fact, the following year, when John Adams became president, he then the next year in 1798, he wrote a letter to the militia of Massachusetts, and the whole letter is great. It's worth going and reviewing the whole letter. It's only like 4 paragraphs, super easy. But the most famous line from his letter is, our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. He says, our Constitution only works with Christianity and the Bible, with religion and morality. Why? Because America was built on giving freedom to people. But freedom only works if you have immoral people. Because you give freedom to immoral people, all that happens is immoral things, and then freedom doesn't work, right? So what they understood was, if we don't teach Christianity in the Bible, if we're not promoting that, our Constitution won't even work. And the reason I think this is a big deal is because we are in an era right now, like this notion, we're going to make America great again. I fully support that. However, fundamentally, I know you can't make her great again if you don't know what made her great in the first place. And what made her great in the first place wasn't great economic policies or great immigration policies, although that certainly impacted. What made us great is we built on the right foundation. We built on Christianity and the Bible. And the reason our nation has struggled now for decades is because we are more secular now than we've been in the history of our nation. Okay, and if you have not tracked some of the polling to see that we now have fewer people identifying as Christian than ever before, to see that we now have fewer people reading the Bible than ever before, if you're not tracking that, you should look that up. Now, again, I did mention, I think there's a revival happening, and I really do see that. Partly because there are more young men now that are turning back to Christianity than we've seen like in decades. I mean, I'm in my early 40s, but certainly way before my lifetime, we've never seen a move like this. And it's interesting that God is driving the hearts of young men back to him, and they are coming back to church looking for answers, looking for hope, looking for truth. We are seeing this happen. And so God is definitely not done with this. However, I'm saying that to give hope, but the reality is part of the reason we have done so poorly is a reflection on the church. Because for the church as a whole, and I'm not calling out right where we are right now, the fact that you're here probably means you're in a very different category than the people we're talking about. But the church in America as a whole has spent far more time trying to make converts of all men than make disciples of all men. To where we have far more people who have heard about Jesus than have been taught how to live like Jesus. And I want to encourage you, we have to understand, and by the way, I'm not at any way suggesting we shouldn't tell people about Jesus. Please don't misunderstand that. But we have to make sure we're understanding the framework of this. When we get saved, that's the starting block of the race, and now we learn to run with perseverance the race that is set before us, right? Now we learn to walk in the Spirit and crucify the flesh. Now we learn, right, that old things pass away and all things become new. Well, now we start the journey. Salvation is not the finish line. It's the starting blocks of the race. And part of discipleship, too, is even understanding that when God made the world, God started with the individual, but from the individual, God made different institutions. God made the family, God made the church, and God made government. And God's word applies to all of those areas. And as Christians, we often, again, as a whole, we've been pretty negligent in understanding how the Bible applies in some of those arenas, right? But the reality is the Bible applies to government as much as it applies to the family, as much as it applies to the church. Easy example, if you go look at the Old Testament, Israel's coming out, God's going to make him a nation. God gives Moses all of the law. God puts Aaron in charge of the temple, right? The tabernacle. It's interesting. God gave them separate jurisdictions, but all of the government, all of the political process came from God. The things that we echoed and followed in America, it came from God. And the idea now that we'd say, oh, Christians shouldn't be involved in that, you have so misunderstood an institution that God made, and by the way, misunderstood, you've believed a lie of the devil, that Christians shouldn't be in part of some of these things. And let me just point you to a verse. So in Jeremiah 29, most people know verse 11. It's one of the famous verses a lot of us have in our house or on a pillow or somewhere, right? But it's interesting, if you back up in Jeremiah, and that's the one, I know the thoughts I think for you, declares the Lord, right? It's that verse. But if you back up to beginning of 29, Jeremiah is writing to people, and he says, I'm writing to all those who are being carried away into captivity, who are being carried away into bondage. So these are slaves being taken into Babylon, and he says, in essence, I'm giving you a summation. Go read the whole thing. But in essence, he says, I don't want you to despair. I don't want you to lose hope. He says, don't stop getting married. Don't stop having kids. Don't stop raising families. Don't stop planting crops and harvesting and growing. And then he gets to verse 7. And here's where it gets interesting. He says, and seek the peace of the city, whither I have caused you to be carried away captives. Pray to the Lord for it. For in the peace thereof you shall have peace. They didn't even want to be there. And God's like, but you need to seek the best for it. In fact, you need to pray for it too. And it's strategic, because if it goes better there, it goes better for you. Okay, there's a lot of pragmatism in that, but here's the reality. I think that's not dissimilar to a call God would give us as believers. And this is not believers in America. This is as believers. Because if you are a missionary in some other nation, you know what you're doing? You're trying to seek the peace and prosperity. You're praying for that nation that God would do something. And you know if it goes better in that nation, it goes better for you. So if you're in Japan, right? If you're in China, if you're in North or South Korea, it doesn't matter where you are. If you're in England or Scotland or Ireland, if you're in France or Italy and Germany and Hungary, it doesn't matter. You seek the best for where God has put you, even if you didn't even want to be there. right? Because you can imagine the captives. They're like, I don't even like this place. In fact, I hate these people, right? Now, you might need a heart check, right? Attitude check. But it's interesting that they were challenged to seek the best for the place where God had planted them, okay? This is something I would challenge and encourage. This is where, as believers, part of how we seek the best for the place where God has put us, we might need to start paying attention to who's on the school board, right? Because how are we seeking the best for kids if we're not knowing who's over what they're learning and the books that we're allowing in libraries and the things they're seeing? Maybe when you start getting involved in city council, this is the kind of stuff that there are ways in America. You've been given opportunities to be involved, and part of the way that we seek the best for the place where God has planted us. And as I'm saying this, if you want to even see more of this from a historic context, you can go to our website, wallbuilders.com. You guys have already seen the American Story of the Beginnings. We have a second one, Building the Republic. We actually have many more in our brain that we're working on writing a lot of stuff right now. The first one goes roughly from Columbus through the Constitution. It came out in 2020, and it was right after the 1619 Project came out. So we finished the book by telling some of the abolition story, because we recognized how dishonest the 1619 story was in telling the narrative. And we said, now hang on a second. Like, you're saying America was evil because of this, but let's just walk through a few thoughts on this, because America's not guilty in the way that you're accusing her of being guilty. And she's guilty of a lot of stuff, but just not all the sins you're saying she's committed. But the second one goes back and picks up from the Constitution and goes through the first 8 presidents. Eventually we'll have them in order where we'll go through picking up from kind of the abolition, growth, and movement, westward expansion. It's going to go through the Civil War. It'll go through the end of Reconstruction. We'll come all the way probably in through the space race, catching up. And then we have lots of spinoffs we're going to write as well. So if you guys want to know more about this, I'd encourage you to check these out. We write them in story form. So it's not a typical book where you're going to pick up a history book and read about dates and dead people. It literally is a story. Just like I did with these battles we were talking about, we're telling the story. We're using their quotes, timelines. There's more than 1,000 footnotes in the back of all these, because one of the things that's also very important as you are studying this is, and I think, again, this is a reflection on the church probably not being discipled as well as we should, is we encourage you, don't trust us on anything we're telling you. Please go look it up. There's a reason we put a footnote in there. It's similar to in Acts 17, what Paul did with the Bereans, right? Where the Bereans are like, we don't trust this guy. Like, I hear what you're saying, hang on. And if you remember, the Apostle Paul is trying to share Jesus with them, but there's no New Testament yet. So he's probably referencing like some of the prophecies. So he's probably quoting Isaiah. And he's like, guys, Isaiah prophesied. And they're like, wait a second, we don't trust this guy. So I'm going to get the scroll of Isaiah. And they would bring it out and they'd read it and be like, oh, Isaiah said that. Okay, Paul, you may continue. He's like, thank you. Well, we know Joel also prophesied. And they're like, wait a second, somebody get Joel. And literally, they're like fact checking him real time. But Paul praises them. Why? Because they will never be misled, because they're always pursuing truth. We have become far, far too comfortable with just letting somebody else tell us what truth is and not being pursuers of truth as we should. And so I want to encourage us, if you want to know more, I encourage you can check out the website. But let me give you one more verse as we wrap this up. Our name WallBuilders, my dad took from the Bible story of Nehemiah 40 years ago. He was really encouraged and challenged by that. If you remember, Nehemiah was in a place where he didn't want to be there either, cupbearer to the king. And he's so grieved that his nation was in ruins. The king sees him, right? Again, not a good situation if you know the story. The king sees him looking downtrodden. What's wrong? I'm grieved because of how bad my nation is. And it's interesting that an ungodly king provided the opportunity for the foundation to be restored. It's interesting, right? Cyrus, not the most godly guy there was, but he supported what God was doing. And Nehemiah went back to rebuild. And it's a lot of interesting parallels with a lot of this as we're going. But when he goes back to rebuild, there were people that said, hey, there's too much. It can't be done. Too many, all these challenges and problems. There's all these critics. And Nehemiah said, you know what, forget it. I just want the whosoever wills. If you're willing, come in, live with me. And it's super fascinating too, because the people that rebuilt the wall, there is no indication from Nehemiah there was a single professional there. There was no engineer. There's no architect. There's no stonemason. In fact, the people it mentions, there was like an apothecary and his family, his daughters. There was the priest, and Nehemiah's like, hey, if you can just put some stones up in your own backyard, that'd be awesome. But they start working together. And in 52 days, they completed the task nobody thought they could do. And this is where I want to encourage us, because this is where I think we are in a very unique moment where Nehemiah said, you see the distress we are in. Come, let us build up the wall that we will no longer be a reproach. I don't think you need to put on glasses to see that we've been a reproach for now maybe many decades. But we have a unique opportunity to rebuild the wall like we've never had before. And this is where I want to encourage you. This is the time to roll up our sleeves and let's go get to work on this. I understand in Colorado, you will have different challenges, and you can look at people like Oklahoma and Arkansas and people that were super conservative states. I get it. But in the midst of what God is calling us to do, you might not be in a place that you wanted to be in. You might feel like you've been carried here captive. It's okay. You seek the best for the place where God has you, and you pray to the Lord for it. For when it goes well there, it goes better with you. We roll up our sleeves and we get to work. And I want to encourage us, there's never been a better time to start building than right now, because we've never had better overhead cover from political leaders than like President Trump we have right now. It doesn't mean it's going to be easy in the state, but it is a reason we should be motivated more so at an opportunity that God's given us.